you ever look at someone you love and realize you don't really know them anymore? That's what happened to me. My name's Richard Hale, and for 58 years I thought I understood life, family, work, faith, purpose. I built everything I had with my bare hands, but nothing prepares you for the day your own blood turns into a stranger. When my son Ethan was born, I swore I'd give him the life I never had. I grew up in rural Ohio, dirt roads and cold winters, where love was tough and discipline tougher. My father didn't say I love you. He showed it by keeping food on the table. I wanted to be different. I wanted Ethan to feel loved, not just fed. And for a while, I did it. We were close. Baseball on Sundays, pancakes on Saturday mornings. He'd run around the yard with that old wooden bat I carved myself. His laughter filled the house like sunlight. Back then, every sacrifice felt worth it. The extra shifts, the sleepless nights, it all meant something. But life changes you. And people change faster than you expect. When my wife Martha passed from cancer, Ethan was 17. I remember his eyes that day, cold, angry, lost. I thought grief would pull us closer. Instead, it drove us apart. He stopped talking, stopped showing up for dinner. A few months later, he left for college in Chicago and never looked back. At first, I gave him space. You don't chase a storm, you wait for it to pass. But years went by and the calls got shorter. Birthdays became text messages. "Happy birthday, Dad, hope you're well." That was it. I'd reply, but I always got that same dull silence. Still, I never gave up. Fathers don't quit on their kids. When Ethan graduated, I flew out to Chicago. I was so proud. I even wore the same Navy suit I'd worn to his first school play. I sat in the crowd waiting for him to spot me. But when he walked across that stage, he didn't even look my way. I brushed it off, told myself, he's nervous, he's busy. But when the ceremony ended, I realized he hadn't even told his friends I was coming. They asked him who I was, and he laughed, said just some guy from back home. That moment, something inside me cracked. Not anger, no, not yet. Just a cold emptiness, the kind you can't explain. I still remember the car ride back to the motel that night. The city lights blurred through my windshield, and I just kept hearing his voice in my head. Just some guy. But I told myself maybe it was just youth. Maybe time would fix it, and for a while, it seemed like it did. He got a good job in finance, bought a condo, started dating a woman named Clara. She was charming, southern accent. Polite smile, the kind who calls everyone sir and ma'am. When I met her, she said, "Mr. Hale, you raised a wonderful man." And I believed her, until the day I didn't. One spring evening, I got a call from my old friend Tom, who worked for a small logistics firm in Chicago. He said, "Rick, I think your boy's into something shady." I laughed it off. Ethan was a suit and tie kid, straight A student, never missed curfew as a teenager. What could he possibly be mixed up in? Then Tom emailed me a file, bank statements, contracts. Ethan had been using my company's name, Hale Construction Group, to move money overseas. My name, my signature, forged. At first I thought there had to be a mistake. Maybe identity theft, maybe some hacker. But the deeper I looked, the worse it got. Ethan had set up fake shell accounts using my old business license number, the one I'd retired 5 years ago. He'd used it to cover for illegal transfers, millions. I remember sitting there in my workshop, staring at those papers, hands trembling. The same hands that once held him when he cried. The same hands that taught him to drive. No, they were shaking because of him. I called him that night. He didn't pick up. So I called again, and again. Finally, he answered. His voice was calm, careless. "Dad, what's going on?" I told him everything. The documents, the signatures, the transfers. There was silence on the other end, then a sigh. "Dad, you wouldn't understand. It's just business. Everyone does it. Everyone does it." Those words burned through me like acid. I said, "You stole from me, from the company your mother helped build." And he said, "It's not stealing if I deserve it." That's when I knew the son I raised was gone. Something darker had taken his place. I didn't yell. I didn't curse. I just whispered, "Ethan, do you know what you've done?" And he laughed. Actually laughed. "Relax, old man. You'll thank me when the money rolls in." Then he hung up. That night I didn't sleep. I walked through the house Martha and I built, every picture frame reminding me of who we used to be. Ethan's graduation photo, his Little League trophy, the drawing he made of me when he was 5, my hero. I tore it off the wall and just stood there, holding it, shaking. Somewhere deep inside, something turned off. The father in me died that night. The next morning, I opened a new notebook, wrote one sentence at the top: make him understand. I didn't know what that meant yet. Not revenge, not justice, just understanding. But over the next few weeks, as I watched the news, read the reports about corporate scandals, I started realizing something. Ethan wasn't just greedy, he was reckless. He thought the world couldn't touch him. So I decided I'd show him what consequences feel like. Not with anger, with precision. Because a father knows his son's weaknesses better than anyone, and I was about to use every one of them. When the call ended and the line went dead, I felt the room tilt. For a long time I sat in the dark and let the silence do its work. I kept asking myself the same question over and over. Why? Why would my son betray his own family, his own name? Why would he trade everything we built for a hollow promise of power? You don't stop being a father just because you're hurt. You change. Pain sharpens you. It makes you pay attention to details you once ignored. I started looking back through records, old emails, invoices, paper trails I had never thought to check. I'd been running Hale Construction with a quiet pride for 28 years. We built neighborhoods, fixed roads, put up the houses where people fell asleep under a safe roof. That name meant something. It still did, except now it was being used as a mask. Tom was right. The transfers were there, the shell companies, the invoices with faces I'd never seen. I learned that Ethan had been moving money to offshore accounts, hiding ownership through layers of corporations, and using my retired tax ID to grease the wheels. He'd convinced a handful of men, young, hungry, reckless, to sign papers. He'd paid people to look the other way, but it wasn't just the money. It was the way he did it, like a surgeon with no regard for the body he cut. He'd lied to partners, convinced honest foremen to sign fake work orders, and cut corners on safety. Projects that had been my life's work were suddenly projects he treated like checkboxes. I remember the first time I let anger take the wheel. I drove to his condo in Chicago. I wanted to look him in the eye, to tell him what he'd done. I parked 2 blocks away and just watched. Ethan came out in a luxury car I didn't own. Black, expensive, the kind of car that announces itself. He walked with Clara beside him. She laughed at something on his phone. They looked like they belonged to a world I had no place in. For a moment, I thought about storming the door, confronting him in front of Clara. But I knew that scene. I'd played it before in my head. Yelling never solved anything. It only left bruises that time healed poorly. I wanted him to feel what it meant to be stripped of everything he thought was untouchable. Not humiliation on the street, real consequences. Quiet, unstoppable consequences. So I did what I had always done when confronting a problem. I planned. Revenge, as I came to understand it, is not a moment. It is a series of small, unrelenting choices. It's patience. It's detail. It's the slow removal of the supports that hold a person up until they fall. First, I needed facts. Real proof, not gossip or second-hand notes. I started with the people closest to him. Tom had been my first break. He'd been willing to walk in the rain to hand me a file and say, "Rick, this is wrong." After that, I called Maria Collins, Ethan's old professor in finance, someone I'd met at a charity event years ago. She owed me a favor. She dug into the academic side and found irregularities in some of Ethan's filings, papers that had been doctored to support his business model. Small things, but enough to start a pattern. Next, I quietly reactivated an old company email address that still had a forward to my personal account. It was the kind of trick a small business owner keeps for emergencies, an old line nobody thinks about. Over the next few days, it caught emails that were going to the shell companies. The more I read, the more certain I became that Ethan wasn't just greedy. He had built a network. At night, while the house slept, I wrote notes. I made a folder labeled Ethan. I printed every email, every bank record, every counterpart's name. I made a map, almost like a genealogy, only it traced transactions and lies. I realized that because he had used my name, I had leverage. Not legal leverage at first, but reputational leverage. People respected Hale Construction. They trusted that name. If I could show the truth carefully, I could call the bluff of everyone he'd used. I thought about going to the police. I thought about lawyers, but I remembered what Clara had said when she met me. You raised a wonderful man. She'd said it with that practiced smile. If I went legal too early, the story could be buried. People would look the other way for fear of scandal. Besides, the law moves slow, and Ethan had time on his side. Instead, I decided to attack the one thing he cared about more than money: status. He loved being seen as an insider. He loved the prestige the city's elite afforded him. He wanted to be untouchable. My plan would not involve arrests or violence. It would be surgical: reputation, contracts, partners, and then exposure. Remove the scaffolding. Let the building collapse. First move, isolate him. I walked into the office of Laura Park, a managing partner at a local investment firm who had been friendly to Ethan. I didn't give her a speech. I simply placed a manila envelope on her desk and said, "Read this, and then call me." Inside were copies of forged invoices, email chains showing his involvement, and notes detailing how he'd used my company. She read, her face tightening like a shoe that was too small. "Rick, are you sure?" she asked finally. "Absolutely," I said. She didn't promise action, but she called a meeting with a handful of clients. Reputation matters to them. It always has. The next week, a subtle thing happened. One partner pulled an offer, citing concern over exposure. Another delayed signing a project until more checks were done. The trickle had begun. Second move, expose the contracts. I found out that Ethan had been relying on a small non-profit, Haven Homes, to front some of his contracts. I had worked with Haven Homes on a community build 10 years earlier. They respected the Hale name. I reached out to their director, Angela Reed, and told her plainly what I'd found. She was devastated. "We trusted him," she said. "We can't afford this." Angela agreed to pause the projects tied to the suspicious accounts. That pause reverberated. Men who had expected quick payouts suddenly had to answer to boards. Lenders pulled back. Ethan's cash flow, carefully disguised as endless, slowed. Third move, the board. Hale Construction still had some old clients and a small board of local trustees. I drove to the next meeting and sat in the back. When the floor opened for questions, I asked, "Has anyone verified that our retired tax ID isn't being used by outside parties?" They looked at me like I'd asked if the sky was blue, but their counsel ran checks. Within days, the board found anomalies. They put holds on any projects that had signs of third-party involvement. By then, Ethan was starting to worry. He called me, voice clipped. "Dad, what are you doing?" He demanded. "You started something," I said. "You used my name to build a life for yourself. Now you'll see what happens when the life you built leans on someone else's scaffolding." He swore. He threatened. He tried to bargain. I listened and made notes. Men like him, charming, fast-talking, always sell themselves as victims when the walls close in. I wasn't interested in his words. I wanted the inevitable. But I wasn't done. If I could cut off his partners and freeze his projects, I still needed to close the loop. A public unraveling that would make him answer not just to me, but to the neighbors, donors, and the city that trusted his face. The slow drip of cancelled contracts wouldn't be enough for people who saw success as a shield, so I planned a final move. Make the story public at the right time, with the right messengers. I contacted a reporter I'd met at a community fundraiser, Dana Ames, and gave her a carefully curated packet. Not salacious, not vengeful, just facts, timelines, and the names of companies affected. She promised discretion and a fair peace. I felt like a man building a fuse. Each cut I made was a match burned slowly toward a single point. I told no one but the few I needed. Tom, Maria, Angela, Laura, Dana, each had a role to play now. Verify, pause, notify, publish. As the pressure grew, Ethan became reckless. He made bad calls, outright lies to lenders, frantic wire transfers that left a trail, a meeting with a contractor where he promised things he couldn't deliver. His arrogance, which once served as armor, now made him sloppy. There was one night I won't forget. He came to the old house without warning. No knocking, just standing on the porch with that look he used to have when he was a boy, asking to stay up late. I opened the door. He smelled of cologne and privilege, a sharp contrast to the smell of sawdust and coffee I'd lived with for years. "You don't have to do this, Dad," he said, voice softer. "Come with me. I can fix it. We can be a family again." I looked at him. I saw the boy, the teenager, the young man I'd raised. I felt every memory crash into me like winter surf. For a second, I almost believed him. Then he smiled in that way that said he thought he'd won me over. He reached for my hand like a child asking for forgiveness, but he didn't mean it. He was testing the waters, seeing if my defenses had cracks. I took his hand, and I felt for the pulse of the man he had become. It was steady, sure. Not weak, not repentant. If anything, he was trying to charm me into silence. I told him quietly, "This isn't about being a family, Ethan. This is about something you can't buy back." He laughed briefly, then left. I closed the door and leaned against it until the wood stopped shaking. That night I added a new line to my list: be ready to strike when the story lands. The pieces were moving faster now. Contracts were in limbo. Partners were asking questions. Lenders were calling in favors. My name was on the line too, and I was ready to own it. I was ready to do whatever it took to expose what he'd done, to make him face the world he wanted so badly to impress. But I wanted it to be clean. I wanted it to be undeniable. "No," he said, she said. "No bluffing." The moment would come when everything I had gathered would be delivered to the right people. The board, the donor community, the press, the banks. I could feel the tension tighten like a bowstring. I could see the moment when the arrow would fly. In the quiet before that flight, I found a strange calm. This was no longer about anger. It had become duty. Duty to the people who trusted our name. Duty to the life Martha and I had built. Duty to a truth that deserved to be told. I folded the documents, tucked them into a folder marked Hale, Proof, and slid it into a locked box. Tomorrow, Dana would call. Tomorrow, the city would wake up to a story it didn't expect. Tomorrow, Ethan would learn what happens when a life built on borrowed respect collapses. As I turned out the light, I felt the old house breathe. I thought of the boy with the wooden bat and the way he used to run down the yard. I thought of how easily childhood becomes a memory that people rewrite when it suits them. And I wondered, just for a heartbeat, if I was doing the right thing. Then I closed my eyes and let the plan take over. The fuse was lit, the countdown had begun. The morning the story ran, the city felt different. It was like waking up to snow after a long, dry fall, sudden, quiet, and impossible to ignore. Dana's piece was clean. No sensationalism, just facts laid out one after another. Forged invoices. Shell companies, bank transfers tied to my retired tax ID, affected non-profit projects, and a pattern of cut corners that endangered people's homes. She quoted emails. She quoted the documents I'd given her. She did not call me a monster. She called the truth what it was. Within hours, my phone blew up. Calls I expected, board members, lenders, Angela came first. Then calls I hadn't expected. Reporters from national outlets, neighbors who donated to Haven Homes, and even a man from a small-town bank who said, "Rick, we need to talk." Every call tightened the noose Ethan had been living in. The trickle became a flood. I watched the feeds in my workshop, the little radio of my life, while the coffee cooled. On the screen, Ethan's face looked smaller than I remembered, paler. The charm drained into defensive interviews where he called it an unfortunate misunderstanding and blamed auditors and misplaced trust. The city's elite who once shook his hand now avoided his events. Clara's name appeared in a few articles, quoted as disturbed and shocked. She was no longer the polished, smiling woman I'd met. I wondered if she'd ever truly know him. By noon, lenders were demanding audits. Contractors withdrew. Haven Homes, suspended the projects connected to his accounts. People wanted distance from the name Ethan had used like a cloak. I heard rumors of clients quietly requesting refunds, of board members calling for emergency meetings. The scaffolding around his life was collapsing one plank at a time. He called me twice that day. Once in the morning, his voice raw. "Dad, please, you don't have to do this. I can fix it." Let him what? Rewrite all those emails? Make the forged signatures disappear? He sounded small, the way he did when he was a kid, trying to bargain for a later bedtime. I listened to him beg like that and felt something like pity. It passed quickly. "That's not how this works, Ethan," I said. "You made choices. You used people. You used our name." He begged again, money, favors, his voice sliding into lies that sounded rehearsed. "It was for us, for the family business. I was trying to expand. I thought I could handle it." I wanted to tell him that the only person he'd ever needed to impress was gone, Martha, and that he'd used her memory as a ladder. But I only said, "You had chances to stop. You didn't." By the afternoon, the local news had a town hall feel. People called into radio shows. Dana's inbox filled with tips. A donor for Haven Homes told her he'd been pressured into signing a contract he barely understood. Another contractor admitted he'd been paid in offshore checks. Details spilled like glass from a broken vase. When the official audit began, it was fast and brutal. Auditors moved through ledgers like surgeons. What they found validated everything: forged purchase orders, misreported invoices, and a web of partnerships designed to hide true ownership. The board at Hale Construction suspended any project with suspicious ties. Lenders froze lines of credit. Ethan's phone, once full of messages arranging dinners and meetings, filled with calls he couldn't answer. Then the hardest thing, people I respected stared at me with new eyes. Some were sympathetic. Others were careful. Trust is fragile, and you can see the fracture lines when a scandal touches the name you gave your life to. I felt the sting, not because I feared losing reputation, but because I remembered why that reputation mattered. It mattered for people who relied on us. It mattered for the houses we built and the safety we promised. Ethan's world dwindled quickly. Clara left. I read that in a short column. Separation, the paper said, like it was a footnote. His partners publicly distanced themselves. A few men who'd signed papers for him quietly asked the courts to investigate. Within a week, his business was collapsing under the weight of the truth. The thing about seeing a son fall apart is that it's messy and quiet at the same time. He wasn't dramatic. He didn't collapse in the middle of the street. He made small, private mistakes, late-night wires, frantic apologies, desperate promises. Once a man showed up at my door, insisting he'd been cheated by Ethan. He wanted answers. I gave him what I had. He looked at me with raw pain and said, "I trusted his name." In that moment, I realized how far-reaching Ethan's choices were. A month later, the public inquiries led to legal action. Contracts were renegotiated, settlements paid. Ethan's financial life unraveled. He was forced to sell assets, and the condo was listed as for sale. The proud young man who once walked in shiny shoes now walked with hands in his pockets and eyes that darted away. People asked me if I felt vindicated. They wanted the classic revenge answer: triumph, satisfaction. For a while, I lied to myself. The look on his face at the first board meeting, where he was asked to explain himself, that stammer, the way his voice cracked, felt like something I'd been waiting for. But the feeling didn't hold. After the dust settled, I sat in the workshop late at night and looked at the drawing he'd made when he was 5. The crooked house with a big sun and stick figures. My hero, he'd written under it in wobbling letters. I'd kept it in an old toolbox like a relic. I took it out and ran my fingers over the crayon lines. The colors hadn't changed, but the meaning had. Was I right to expose him? I told myself yes. He had to face the consequences. The people who were hurt needed restitution. My name, our work needed clearing. I'd done what I thought duty required, but duty and revenge are not the same thing, and the truth has a way of landing differently than you plan. In the following weeks, I began to notice a hollowness I hadn't expected. The anger that had driven me was replaced by a tiredness that felt older than me. I'd set the clock in motion and now I was watching time pass. The victory felt like an empty room. Ethan called once more, months later, voice thin. "Dad, can we talk?" He asked. I invited him over. He came in, took off his coat, sat at the kitchen table where we used to eat pancakes. His hands were shaking. He looked older than his years. "I'm sorry," he said, and for once it seemed true. Not the slick apologies that had come through phone lines, but a quiet, small apology that felt like beginning. He said he'd been selfish. He said he hadn't understood the ripple effect of his choices. I wanted to forgive him. Fathers want to forgive, but forgiveness isn't an on-off switch. It's a process. I told him that consequences had happened. People had lost money. Trust had been broken. I did what I thought necessary, I said. Maybe I was too hard. Maybe I was right. But I did it to protect others. He looked at me, and for a moment I saw the boy again. Not the man who'd used my name, but the 5-year-old with the wooden bat. He reached for the drawing in my hand. "Do you remember when I made this?" He asked. "I do," I said. "You called me your hero." "I was trying to," he said. "I thought being big meant doing whatever it took." "It doesn't," I said. "It means taking responsibility." We sat in silence then, two old souls in a kitchen that had seen everything. Time, as it always does, healed some things and hardened others. Ethan found work doing small consulting, a job that kept him away from big ledgers and grand promises. He attended meetings with people he'd hurt and tried in small ways to make things right. It wasn't enough for everyone. It was something. As for me, I kept working. I went back to the sites, to the neighborhoods where kids still played under the roofs we'd built. I found purpose there, repairing a deck, listening to a neighbor's worry, making sure that the name Hale still meant safety. That, more than any public victory, felt like the right kind of justice. If there is a moral to this, it is messy and simple. Revenge can right a wrong on paper. It can make the guilty face consequences. But revenge does not heal a broken home. It does not bring the dead back or erase the nights of quiet betrayal. It changes you, sometimes in ways you can't predict. In the end, I closed the loop on a lie that had used our name. I exposed the harm and paused the damage. But standing in the quiet after the storm, I learned the hardest lesson. Truth matters, yes, but so does mercy, and so does the work of rebuilding what was broken. The real change wasn't in taking him down. It was in finding a way to keep building. Houses, trust, and if possible, a relationship that could begin again on honest ground. You ever look at someone you love and realize you barely know them? I did. I also learned that knowing them doesn't mean you stop trying to understand, to set things right, and to choose what kind of man you'll be when the dust settles. That's the story of my son and me. How betrayal broke us, how exposure brought consequences, and how, after everything, the work of repair began. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't clean, but it was real.